I discovered something during my years studying the human psyche that most people aren't ready to accept. Not everyone you meet is fully individuated. Not everyone operates with the same level of consciousness. Some people you interact with every day might be living entirely through borrowed thoughts, collective patterns, and unconscious programming. They look human, they speak, they react, they follow routines. But beneath the surface, something is fundamentally different. You've sensed it before, haven't you? That strange hollowness when you look into certain eyes, the robotic way some people repeat cultural narratives without ever questioning them, the complete absence of original thought or genuine self-reflection. I spent decades exploring the depths of the human mind, and what I found was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. The evidence is everywhere once you understand what to look for. And by the end of this, you might never look at humanity the same way again. Most people assume that consciousness is universal, that if someone walks, talks, and responds to stimuli, they must possess the same inner awareness you do. But what if that assumption is dangerously wrong? What if a significant portion of humanity exists in what I called a state of unconsciousness, operating purely through what I termed the collective unconscious, never developing true individual awareness? This isn't some modern internet theory. This is the culmination of my life's work studying the human psyche, and the implications are more disturbing than you can imagine. I identified this pattern early in my career. While working at the Burgholzli Psychiatric Hospital, I noticed something peculiar. Some patients showed no signs of individual psychological development. They existed entirely as expressions of collective patterns, archetypes, playing out through human vessels without any real self-awareness directing the process. But it wasn't just my patients. I saw it everywhere, in society, in my colleagues, in people I encountered daily. Individuals who had never once questioned their existence, never examined their own thoughts, never developed what I called the individuated self. I wrote extensively about this. I described how most people live their entire lives, identified with the persona, the social mask, never realizing there's supposed to be someone behind that mask. They are the mask. There's nothing else there. The persona isn't just a role they play. It's the totality of their existence. Think about the people you know. How many of them have ever demonstrated true self-reflection? How many have questioned the beliefs they were raised with, examined their own psychological patterns, or shown evidence of an inner life that extends beyond social programming? I called this phenomenon living in a state of unconsciousness. These individuals are entirely possessed by collective forces, by what I termed archetypes, operating through them without any mediating consciousness to provide individual direction or awareness. They don't think, they are thought through. They don't act, they are acted upon. They don't exist as individuals, they exist as hollow vessels for collective psychological content. Modern psychology has tried to soften this truth, but I never did. In my private writings and letters, I was remarkably direct about this. Most of humanity, I observed, never individuates. They remain psychological children their entire lives, completely identified with collective values, never developing true psychological autonomy. The process of individuation, which I considered the primary task of human existence, requires something most people simply don't possess. It requires the ability to step back from your conditioning, to observe your own psychological processes, to separate what is genuinely you from what has been implanted by culture, family, and society. But here's what I discovered that changed everything. Some people cannot do this, not because they choose not to, but because there's no observing consciousness present to do the observing. I explored this through my work on psychological types. I discovered that consciousness itself exists on a spectrum. Some individuals possess what I called superior consciousness, the ability to hold opposing thoughts, to transcend simple binary thinking, to engage in genuine psychological reflection. Others operate entirely through inferior functions, reacting to life through unconscious patterns, without any higher awareness directing the process. When I studied synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that revealed the interconnected nature of psyche and matter, I noticed something crucial. These experiences only occurred for individuals with developed consciousness. The unconscious masses never reported them, never noticed them, because noticing requires a level of awareness they simply don't possess. They move through life in a fog, never seeing the deeper patterns, never questioning the surface reality, never experiencing the numinous moments that reveal consciousness interacting with the fabric of reality itself. I documented this in my work on active imagination. When I instructed patients to engage with their unconscious through this technique, something remarkable happened. Some could do it immediately. They possessed an observing ego capable of witnessing unconscious content without being overwhelmed by it. But others couldn't do it at all. There was no observing consciousness present. They would simply be swept away by whatever psychological content emerged, with no center of awareness to maintain perspective. This is what I meant when I wrote that most people are not individuals. They are collective beings, psychological pluralities without any unifying center of consciousness. The evidence extends far beyond my clinical observations. Throughout history, mystics and philosophers have described this same phenomenon. Gnostics spoke of humans divided into categories, some possessing pneuma, spiritual consciousness, while others possessed only psyche or even just pure materiality without any spark of genuine awareness. This wasn't metaphorical. They were describing observable differences in human consciousness. I corresponded with physicists, with religious scholars, with mystics from various traditions. All of them had noticed this same pattern. Not everyone operates at the same level of consciousness. Some appear to be empty vessels running on biological programming without any genuine self-awareness. Here's where my work intersects with something even more disturbing. I developed the concept of the collective unconscious, the shared psychological substrate underlying all human consciousness. But I observed that some people exist entirely within this collective layer. They never develop individual consciousness that transcends it. They are hollow, psychological shells, non-player characters in the truest sense. When I analyzed dreams, I could immediately distinguish between individuals with developed consciousness and those without. The individuated person's dreams showed evidence of an observing ego, a psychological center working through unconscious material toward integration and growth. The unindividuated person's dreams were different. They were simply collective archetypes playing out mechanically, with no individual consciousness directing or learning from the process, just patterns repeating endlessly, like a machine stuck in a loop. I wrote that modern man is unconscious of himself. But I meant this literally. Most people have no idea who they are because there is no coherent self present to be aware of. They are conglomerations of social roles, collective opinions, and biological drives with no unifying consciousness tying it together. Some questions cannot be asked openly in modern society. Some truths are too uncomfortable to speak here. That's why we share deeper psychological insights in Insights Academy, our free newsletter, where we expose the ideas too controversial for this platform. Sign up now using the link in the description and receive a free copy of the Kabbalion for a limited time only. The implications of my discoveries extend far beyond individual psychology. If most humans exist in a state of unconsciousness, completely identified with collective patterns, then what does that say about society itself? What happens when the majority of humanity operates on psychological autopilot, responding to archetypal patterns without any individual awareness mediating the process? I observed this throughout the 20th century. The rise of mass movements, the ease with which populations could be swept into collective hysteria, the complete absence of individual moral reasoning when group psychology took over. This wasn't just poor education or propaganda. This was the natural result of a population that largely lacks individual consciousness. I wrote extensively about psychological projection, the unconscious mechanism by which people attribute their own unexamined psychological content onto others. But I noticed something crucial. True projection only happens when there's an unconscious present to project from. The individuals I'm describing don't even have that. They simply mirror whatever collective content is dominant in their environment. They don't project their psychology onto others because they have no individual psychology to project. They are pure mimicry, hollow reflectors of cultural programming. You've encountered these people, I guarantee it. Perhaps you've tried discussing complex psychological or philosophical ideas with them only to receive pre-programmed responses that sound like they were downloaded directly from mainstream media or popular culture. They're not engaging in genuine thought. They're reciting scripts. And if you pay attention, you'll notice they use the exact same phrases as millions of others, word for word, as if they're all accessing the same limited database of acceptable responses. When I developed the concept of the shadow, the rejected and repressed aspects of personality, I discovered that individuated people engage in shadow work. They confront their darkness, integrate it, and become more psychologically whole. But the individuals I'm describing have no shadow in the psychological sense. They have no repressed individual content because they never developed individual content in the first place. They exist entirely on the surface, psychological flatness masquerading as human depth. This is why certain people never grow, never change, never develop greater self-awareness, no matter what experiences life throws at them. Experience only creates growth when there's a conscious self present to learn from it. Without that, life just happens to them repeatedly, and they remain exactly the same. I studied this through my work on alchemy. The alchemical process of transformation requires a conscious operator. The alchemist doesn't just mix chemicals randomly. There's an aware intelligence directing the process, observing the changes, guiding the transformation. But most people are the chemicals, not the alchemist. They are the raw material being transformed by forces they don't understand and can't direct because there's no conscious operator present within their psyche. The greatest thinkers throughout history have pointed to this truth. Plato's cave allegory wasn't just metaphor. He was describing people who mistake shadows for reality because they lack the consciousness necessary to turn around and see the true source of light. Gurdjieff taught that humans are machines asleep even when they think they're awake. He claimed that developing real consciousness required enormous effort because most people are born without it. I agreed with him completely. Consciousness isn't a given. It's a potential that most never actualize. During my explorations of Eastern philosophy, I encountered the Buddhist concept of anatta, no self. But I realized the Buddha wasn't teaching that no one has a self. He was observing that most people lack a unified self to begin with. They are collections of skandhas, aggregates with no coherent center. The individuated self I described in my work is precisely what most of humanity never develops. Neuroscience is beginning to confirm what I observed clinically. Studies show that a significant portion of the population lacks an internal monologue. They don't have a constant stream of conscious thought. They simply react to stimuli without any internal commentary or reflection. Think about what that means. No inner voice, no ongoing self-reflection, just stimulus and response, like a biological machine. Brain scans reveal that people who engage in self-reflection show dramatically different neural activity than those who don't. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for higher order thinking and self-awareness, shows minimal activity in individuals who never examine their own thoughts or behaviors. They literally lack the neurological patterns associated with conscious self-reflection. I predicted this. I wrote that consciousness itself has varying degrees of development, and that most people exist at the lowest levels, barely above unconscious animal instinct. Some never transcend that level. They spend their entire lives in a dreamlike state, responding to archetypal patterns and social conditioning without ever waking up to genuine self-awareness. The question I wrestled with for decades was this: can these individuals be awakened? Can someone who has never developed individual consciousness suddenly acquire it? My conclusion after years of clinical work was unsettling. In most cases, no. Individuation requires certain psychological preconditions. It requires the transcendent function, the ability of the psyche to hold and reconcile opposing forces. But if that capacity was never developed, if the psychological structure necessary for conscious self-reflection never formed, then the person remains trapped in unconscious identification with collective patterns. They cannot wake up because there's no one there to wake up. This is the hard truth I discovered. Not everyone is on a journey of psychological development. Some people are simply here, existing without growing, without questioning, without ever developing true self-awareness. They are background characters in the fullest sense. They populate the world, they interact with conscious individuals, but they never truly participate in the deeper reality of psychological and spiritual development. I observe this in my work with archetypes. Conscious individuals engage with archetypes consciously. They recognize archetypal patterns playing out in their lives and integrate them into a more complete sense of self. Unconscious individuals are simply possessed by archetypes. The archetype moves through them without any mediating awareness. They become the hero, the victim, the caregiver, the rebel, but they never recognize these as patterns. They believe these patterns are their identity. The scariest part of my research was realizing how many people fit this description. During my years of clinical practice, I would estimate that fewer than 1 in 10 individuals showed genuine signs of psychological individuation. The rest existed in varying states of unconsciousness, completely identified with social roles, family expectations, cultural narratives, never once stepping back to ask, "Who am I beyond all of this conditioning?" I wrote that the meeting with oneself is one of the most unpleasant experiences because it requires confronting everything you've repressed and denied. But I should have been more direct. Most people never have this meeting because there's no self present to meet. When I explored mythology and fairy tales, I recognized that these stories were describing the individuation process. The hero's journey isn't just entertainment, it's a map of psychological development from unconscious identification to conscious self-awareness. But these stories only resonate with individuals capable of that journey. The majority never see themselves in these narratives because they're not on a hero's journey. They're extras in someone else's story. This explains why certain people respond so violently when you challenge their beliefs. You're not just questioning an opinion, you're threatening the entirety of their psychological existence. Their beliefs aren't held by a self, their beliefs are the self. Remove the beliefs, and there's nothing left. I saw this in my break with Freud. He was completely identified with his theories. They weren't ideas he held, they were his psychological identity. Challenging them meant challenging his very existence, and he responded exactly as you'd expect from someone with no independent self to fall back on. Pure defensive reaction, no reflection, no consideration, just blind protection of the ego structure. The individuated person can hold their beliefs loosely because they know they exist independently of their ideas. The unindividuated person must defend their beliefs absolutely because without them they dissolve into psychological nothingness. So how do you recognize these individuals? I developed several indicators throughout my career. First, watch for psychological rigidity. The unindividuated person cannot handle ambiguity, paradox, or complexity. They need simple answers, binary thinking, clear categories. This isn't a preference, it's a psychological limitation. Second, observe their relationship to authority. The unconscious individual requires external authority to function. They need experts, institutions, cultural leaders to tell them what to think because they lack the internal authority that comes from developed consciousness. Third, notice their response to the numinous. When confronted with experiences that transcend ordinary reality, synchronicities, profound dreams, mystical insights, do they recognize the significance? Or do they dismiss it immediately, unable to perceive anything beyond surface materialism? The unconscious individual is blind to the numinous because perception of it requires developed consciousness. Fourth, examine their capacity for genuine psychological change. Do they grow from experience? Do they integrate new understanding into a developing sense of self? Or do they simply repeat the same patterns endlessly, never learning, never evolving, stuck in psychological loops they can't escape? Fifth, analyze the quality of their questions. The individuated person asks questions about meaning, purpose, existence, consciousness itself. The unindividuated person only asks practical questions about navigating social reality. They never wonder about the deeper nature of existence because they lack the consciousness necessary for that level of inquiry. I spent my life studying these patterns, and the conclusion was inescapable. Humanity is divided, not by race, class, or nationality, but by consciousness itself. Some possess the spark of individual awareness, most do not. And here's what terrifies people about this truth. You can't always tell which category you fall into. The unconscious person is convinced they're conscious. They believe they're thinking independently, choosing freely, existing as individuals. But belief doesn't create reality. Just because someone believes they're conscious doesn't mean they actually are. The only way to know is through brutal self-examination. Can you observe your own thoughts? Can you step back from your conditioning and recognize it as conditioning rather than truth? Can you hold opposing ideas without psychological discomfort? Can you question your deepest beliefs without your sense of self collapsing? If you can't, then you're still identified with collective patterns. You're still unconscious. You're still running on programming rather than genuine individual awareness. The path to individuation is the hardest journey a human can undertake. It requires confronting everything you believe yourself to be and discovering that most of it is borrowed, imitated, and unconsciously absorbed. It requires building a genuine self from the ground up, something most people never attempt. Most will remain asleep their entire lives, and that's exactly how society prefers it. Because conscious individuals are dangerous. They don't follow orders blindly. They don't absorb propaganda without question. They don't mistake collective hysteria for truth. They think for themselves, and that makes them unpredictable, uncontrollable. I discovered this truth through decades of research, clinical observation, and personal psychological exploration. The evidence is everywhere once you learn to see it. The question is, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you examine yourself honestly? Will you begin the painful process of individuation? Will you separate yourself from collective unconsciousness and develop genuine individual awareness? Or will you dismiss this as elitism, close your mind, and sink back into comfortable unconsciousness? The choice reveals everything, because if you're asking these questions, if you're feeling the weight of this knowledge, if you're recognizing these patterns in yourself and others, then you possess something most people don't. You possess the capacity for consciousness itself, but capacity isn't enough. You have to actualize it. You have to do the work of psychological development that most humans never attempt. And that journey starts now. The world isn't what you thought it was. The people around you aren't who you assumed them to be, but now you have an advantage. You see reality for what it is. And remember, knowledge means nothing if you don't use it. What you just learned is useless unless you take the next step.